Hey, how's it going? And today I'm going to show you how to create a winning message board when players go through the finish line. So it's a finish line winner board. What position the player finished the race in. In the scene I have a button, a race manager, and a checkpoint, and a verse device. And the rest of this is in the code. And this is actually modified from the leaderboard tutorial, but there's a lot of code in there. It's very misleading because it looks simple, but there's a lot of nuance going on, a lot of sophistication going on with this verse code. And I don't know, to me it's fascinating, and that's why I've been doing so many verse tutorials, because it's interesting to watch it evolve. And they add one thing, they keep adding to it, and it just keeps making it more complicated and complicated. And it's supposed to be easy to learn, but to me, it's very nuanced. I'll go through this code, and then at the end, I'll show you how it works. Okay, so here, what I wanted to do was create a log channel to print out to the log. And remember, there's two logs. There's one in Fortnite, and there's one in Unreal Editor, and they're both in kind of different places. I've done tutorials about that. But to print to the log, to do the log print, you need to have a log channel. So this is what we do here: is we create a log channel, and then here we create our instance of a log. And then once we have this instance, we can then call it to print. And that's what we do down here, is that we're printing here. Because when the player leaves the game, there'd be no way to see the message, especially if there's only one player in the game. So we print it to the log. So anyway, we have that log print going up here, and I have a verse device called task raise. And this is an editable for the billboard device, and this is for the race manager, and this is for the button. And then here's a variable for the finish order. And then we just have a message, what I call the finishing message, and it has string interpolation, which will print out this message here. Guess what? You finished in number whatever position. So this is just an integer value. Now here's the part where it gets interesting. We have this get play space, get players. And what this is doing is a pretty powerful methods, because it goes through your game and gets every player and puts them in an array of players of the player type. And this can get really confusing, because a player type is a subclass of the agent. So a player, wherever there's an agent type accepted or needed, a player type will also be accepted, because it's a subclass of the agent type. But it doesn't work the other way. An agent type will not work for a player type. You can sub in a player type for an agent type, but not an agent type for a player type. It's very interesting. So here on this line of code, we're creating an array of players, and I can prove that to you by just typing in here player. So you see it's an array of players. And we don't have to declare an array up here or anything. It's just kind of created automatically down here. So, and then here we just create this event with this button that allows players to leave the game or go to the lobby if they press that button. And if they do that, then this will also be triggered, because once the player leaves, this will print out to the log here. So there is that. Now this is interesting here, and this was kind of frustrating me, because I couldn't find anywhere online where it talks about this do command, but it is apparently a command in verse code, and it's, to me, all it does is just say it executes. It's not quite the same as a then. It just says do it. So for all this, do this. So what this is going to do is it's grabbing our array of players, player references, and player types, and it's cycling through, and it's spawning out. Let's say we had 16 players. This is going to spawn 16 asynchronous functions. So if we have 3 players, it's going to spawn 3. Now spawn is interesting because it's its own self-contained asynchronous function, meaning that if you could send it off to do an infinite loop if you wanted to. Like you could send it off to do a tick function and it would never end. So it just depends what you're spawning out. But the spawn out, essentially what's inside of here could be the condition that leads to its cancellation, but it could also be a condition that never ends until the game ends. What's interesting, most interesting, is that what are we spawning? Well, we're spawning a race concurrency expression. So essentially what we're doing is we're nesting async functions. We're putting an async function inside of an async function concurrency expression. So it's really interesting what's going on here by spawning this race. So it calls, when we spawn, we're spawning this, and this is a method that takes in the player type, right? It's taking in an element from that array, that player, and putting in its own spawn device that's now got two loops racing against each other, which is fascinating if you think about it. And what are they racing against? Well, this line of code here could be confusing, but this essentially is what they call a task. And a task is essentially an object reference that represents the status of an async function. It's waiting for the race completed event, right? It's going to be triggered by the agent. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is confusing. I can see this as being very confusing because this is called, this method, wait for player to finish race, is called with the player type. But notice that it takes in an agent type. But like I was saying, because the player type is a subclass, it will accept the player type in. But this wouldn't work the other way around. What it's doing is it's waiting for one of two things to happen. Either the race gets completed or the player leaves the game. One of those two conditions. So if you think about it, this is not a bad way to set up your game, to manage the status of your players, if you think about it. It's actually a pretty interesting way to do it, because you're actually monitoring two conditions. Did they finish the race or have they left? And then based on what they do, essentially this was set up to where nothing really happened if they left the game. But I added this, that they would actually, I guess I don't need that sleep anymore. I had that in there for something else. But basically this does print out. So this checks to see, is what is in the array match what triggered the race completed event. That's basically what it's doing. It's just matching, making sure that something else, I guess, didn't trigger it, and that what was in the array triggered it, so that it's not false triggering, I guess. So this ends up being, this right here ends up being an object reference to the player that's in the array. And this too. This ends up being an object reference. Another way to say it is, this is checking to make sure that nothing outside of the array is triggered this. That's a better way to say it. So anyway, and then once this breaks, right, this breaks the loop, either they finish the race or they leave, then that breaks the loop, which ends the race, which kills the spawn. It's really pretty heavy if you think about it. And that's that. And so down here, when they finish the race, we just call here, and it adds it increments the score. It starts off as a 0 up here. It starts off as a 0, but then it ends, it gets incremented by 1. So the first one comes in, gets assigned. The first one to finish the race is number 1. The second one comes in as number 2. The third is 3, and whatever. And it prints to the board. And that's it. And then you can leave the game at any time. And that's the whole thing. So let me go in here and compile this real fast. Epic says that verse is easy to learn, but to me there is a lot of depth to it. Like it's not, I don't know. I don't think it's that easy to learn. So anyway, let's go in here and check it out. So here we are. We'll start the game. It starts. And as soon as I go through there, it's just going to say, guess what? You finished in number 1 position. And if there were other players, you know, I would assume that their messages would be number 2 and whatever. So now look, if I come out of here and go in game, and let me start the game again. Now let's say I don't want to play the game, or it's a long race and I got other things to do. I come over here and I press E. I'm out of the game, right? So now if I come in here and I come to my output log, you can see button press, sorry to see you go. So the message prints out. So anyway, this was just kind of a breakdown of that leaderboard code and how you can use it, repurpose it for other things.